At my father's retirement dinner, he raised his glass and announced, "My real children are the ones who truly made me proud." Everyone cheered. Then he faced me and said, "You should leave." I got up, but then my husband got up too. And what he did next left the whole room frozen. Can you imagine being publicly disowned by your own father in front of 70 strangers at his own retirement party? That's what happened to me last spring. Humiliation burned. I wanted to disappear, but then my husband did something that changed everything and redefined what family truly means. Growing up in Brooklyn, a really fancy Boston suburb, it all looked perfect from the outside. Manicured lawns, colonial houses, but inside our home? It was a different story entirely. My dad, Richard Harrington, he wasn't just a banking executive. He was a man who literally measured love, achievements, and every single disappointment. My mom, Elaine, she was beautiful and quiet, but ultimately, she was powerless against his overbearing presence. She'd whisper comfort to me after his tirades, but she never, ever openly defied him. When I lost her to breast cancer at 20, it felt like I lost my only shield, the only buffer between my dad's crushing expectations and my own fragile reality. My older siblings, Jason and Kimberly, they were everything I wasn't. Jason, for years my senior, dove straight into finance, just like Dad, Wharton grad, rocketing up the corporate ladder. Kimberly, 2 years older, became a cardiothoracic surgeon, collecting awards like they were stamps. They were the golden children, the ones who, in my father's words, made our last name mean something. And then there was me. I loved books. I loved art. I found my escape in stories because my real life often felt too harsh. I still remember my 12th birthday recital, playing Debussy's Clair de Lune on our glossy grand piano. Family friends were there, the living room packed. My fingers were trembling, and halfway through, I hit one wrong note. Just one. My father? He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked out. The room went silent, dead silent, except for the sound of our front door closing. I finished the piece, tears blurring my vision, but I finished it. That single moment, it defined everything. One mistake. That was all it took to be deemed utterly unworthy. College felt like a temporary escape. I chose literature at Amherst, completely defying my father's rigid demands for business school. "You're throwing your life away on fairy tales," he sneered when I showed him my acceptance letter. But I went. I funded it myself with scholarships and part-time jobs, because of course, he refused to pay for a useless degree. Those years forged my independence, but they also cemented my struggles with anxiety and self-worth. I'd achieve something, feel proud, only to hear his voice inside my head, always asking why it wasn't more. My dating life was a mess. I'd either gravitate towards men who echoed his criticisms, or I'd push away the good ones, terrified they'd eventually realize I wasn't enough. But then, 3 years ago, everything changed. It was in a little bookstore in Cambridge. I was in the classic literature section, reaching for the last rare edition of Jane Eyre at the exact same moment as someone else. I looked up, and there was Scott Taylor. Kind eyes. A warm smile. And for the very first time, something inside me just settled. "You take it," he insisted. "Anyone hunting for Bronte deserves it more than me." We ended up talking for hours, just across the street at a coffee shop. Scott was a software engineer, loved literature almost as much as I did. He listened. Truly listened. No checking his watch, no preparing his next argument. When I cautiously mentioned my dream of starting a small publishing house for overlooked authors, he didn't laugh. He didn't call it impractical. He asked thoughtful questions. 6 months later, with Scott's incredible encouragement and his help with the financial projections, I launched Lighthouse Press. We focused on literary fiction by diverse voices. Started tiny, just 2 titles the first year. But by year 2, one of our books won a regional award, and we'd expanded to 6 titles. It wasn't making me rich, but oh my God, it was making me proud. Scott and I had a small, beautiful ceremony at the Boston Public Library. My father didn't come. Important business meeting in Chicago, he claimed. Jason sent an expensive, utterly impersonal gift. Kimberly showed up, but left immediately for a conference. "They don't deserve you," Scott whispered to me as we danced at our reception, surrounded by his amazing, loving family instead of mine. It stung. I hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to my father in almost 2 years when the invitation landed. His retirement dinner. 40 years at First Atlantic Bank, stepping down as executive VP. A grand celebration at the Hawthorne, Boston's most exclusive spot. "We don't have to go," Scott said softly, seeing my hands tremble as I held the thick, cream-colored card. "Maybe," I whispered, trying to convince myself, maybe this is his way of reaching out. Maybe things will be different now that he's retiring. The night of the dinner, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror. Navy blue dress, something I usually wouldn't spend that much on. Hair professionally styled, makeup painstakingly applied to hide the shadows from a week of stress-induced insomnia. "You look beautiful," Scott said, adjusting his tie beside me. "I feel like I'm going to throw up," I admitted. And then, just as we were about to leave, a full-blown panic attack hit me. Scott sat with me on the edge of our bed, coaching me through the breathing exercises my therapist had taught me. His hand made slow circles on my back until my breathing finally normalized. "We can still cancel," he reminded me, his voice so gentle. "No," I said, reapplying my lipstick with still shaking hands. "I need to do this. I need to try one more time." As we drove downtown, Scott reached over and squeezed my hand. "Remember," he said, "no matter what happens tonight, you have people who love you for exactly who you are." I nodded, but deep down, I didn't believe him. Decades of conditional love had taught me otherwise. I still believed I had to earn love. And tonight, I hoped, was my last chance to finally make my father proud. The Hawthorne stood there, gleaming against the Boston skyline, almost mocking me. My heels clicked on the cobblestones, each step like a countdown. "Remember to breathe," Scott whispered, his hand reassuring on my lower back. Inside, it was a golden, glittering scene, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing softly, 70 people in formal wear, champagne flutes tinkling. The Boston elite, as my father called them. I spotted Jason immediately, holding court by the bar, looking exactly like a younger version of our dad. Tailored suit, confident stance. "Amanda," he said when he saw us, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think you'd make it?" He barely shook Scott's hand before turning back to his colleagues. "This is my little sister and her husband. Amanda does something with books, don't you?" Before I could even answer, he was back to finance, not bothering to include us. Scott just squeezed my hand gently, and we excused ourselves. Next, Kimberly, near the hors d'oeuvres table, absolutely stunning in a red dress that probably cost more than our monthly rent. She was showing off a huge diamond ring. "June wedding at the plaza," she was saying. Thomas wanted Tuscany, but the humidity would be terrible for photos. She saw me, paused, and her eyes flicked over my navy dress. "Amanda, you came. Navy is so reliable." She introduced us to her fiancé, Thomas, a neurosurgeon with perfect teeth and that distinct Harvard accent. More wedding talk. More medical conferences. Then she was off to greet more important guests. "Your siblings are exactly as advertised," Scott murmured, his voice laced with understanding. I reached for a glass of champagne when I felt a bony hand on my arm. Aunt Patricia. My father's sister. Her hug was stiff, smelled of expensive perfume and judgment. "Amanda, darling," she air-kissed near my cheek. "You look healthy." That slight pause spoke volumes. She'd always sided with my father. "Try to make him proud tonight," she whispered, leaning in. "It's important to him, especially with all his colleagues here." Then she was gone, gushing over Kimberly's ring. The room was a showcase of pure wealth, white roses, vintage wines, endless trays of caviar and scallops. Conversations swirled around stock portfolios, vacation homes, private schools. It felt suffocating. I finally saw my father, across the room, commanding attention in a circle of distinguished men. He was 65, still imposing, silver-haired, radiating an air of someone used to respect. He laughed at something, and for a fleeting second, I saw a warmth I'd almost never experienced myself. Scott sensed my hesitation. Want me to come with you? He asked. I shook my head. No. I should do this alone. Taking a deep breath, I walked towards him. He saw me coming, but kept talking until I was just standing there, awkwardly, at the edge of the circle. Finally, during a pause, he acknowledged me. Amanda, you made it. His tone held mild surprise, definitely not pleasure. Congratulations on your retirement, I said, handing him the gift bag with the expensive fountain pen Scott had helped me pick out. Thank you. He took it without even looking inside. Gentlemen, he announced, my youngest, Amanda. She's in publishing. I own my own small press, actually, I added, trying to find some pride. We just had an author shortlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award. His expression didn't change. Amanda always had her head in the clouds, playing with books while her siblings took on real careers. The men chuckled. Obligingly. Speaking of, he continued, Jason just closed a $40 million deal. And Kimberly is engaged to Dr. Thomas Whitfield, chief resident at Mass General. The message was crystal clear. Their accomplishments mattered. Mine did not. It was nice seeing you, I managed, retreating before the tears stinging my eyes could fall. Scott was waiting with a fresh glass of wine. I gulped it down. That bad? He asked. The usual, I said, forcing a smile. The cocktail hour dragged on. I watched my father move through the room, a king holding court, accepting congratulations. And with each warm greeting he gave someone else, the contrast to his coldness towards me became more and more agonizing. Then came the seating chart. Of course, we were miles away from the main table, far from my father, Jason, Kimberly, and all the important people. Our table mates were distant relatives and junior colleagues, all looking equally disappointed. I'm Scott Taylor, Amanda's husband, Scott announced cheerfully, completely unfazed by the obvious snub. You're Richard's daughter, an older woman across from us asked. The one who isn't a doctor or a banker? I nodded, forcing a smile. I run a publishing company. How nice, she said, her tone dripping with condescension, like she was talking about a child's crayon drawing. A little hobby business. Throughout the three-course meal, I just watched my father at that center table, laughing, engaged with everyone around him. Occasionally, he'd place a proud hand on Jason's shoulder or beam at something Kimberly said. It was a side of him I knew well, but only ever directed at them. Never at me. Scott kept squeezing my hand under the table, his silent support the only thing stopping me from just walking out. The lamb was perfectly cooked, the wine exceptional, but everything tasted like ash in my mouth. Then came the speeches. The bank CEO, a longtime colleague, Jason, who managed to make his speech about our father's legacy primarily about his own. And then, it was my father's turn. The room went quiet. Richard Harrington rose, approached the microphone, commanding the space with such practiced ease. My heart hammered. Faster. Against all hope, I thought, prayed, that this moment, this public reflection on his life, might finally include some small acknowledgement of me. Thank you all for coming tonight, my father began, his voice smooth, effortless. He spoke about his 4 decades at the bank, about challenges, successes. He even mentioned my mother, Elaine. My breath caught. He rarely spoke of her. She was my foundation, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I only wish she could be here tonight to see what her support helped build. Tears stung my eyes. This was the most emotion I'd seen from him in years. Could retirement have softened him? Opened something long closed? Scott's hand found mine under the table. My father cleared his throat. But a man's true legacy isn't measured in dollars or deals. It's measured in who carries forward his values and vision. My heart leapt. Was this it? Was he finally going to acknowledge my path? I've been blessed in that regard, he continued, gesturing to the main table. Jason has exceeded every expectation. Kimberly, saving lives daily as one of Boston's premier surgeons. His voice swelled with pride. He went on, listing their accolades, their achievements. And then, he raised his glass higher. So tonight, as I close one chapter of my life, I look with satisfaction at what matters most. My real children are the ones who made me proud. The room erupted in applause. People turned, smiling at Jason and Kimberly, who accepted the attention with practiced grace. I sat there, frozen. Those words hit me like physical blows. My real children. As if I wasn't his child at all. As if I didn't exist. Or shouldn't. But then it got worse. As the applause died down, his gaze swept the room and landed directly on me. The temperature in the room plummeted. Our eyes met. Across the distance. "You can leave," he said. His voice, perfectly audible in the now quiet room. At first, confusion. Who was he talking to? Then, heads turned. Murmurs. The dawning, sickening realization. My father had just publicly disowned me. My chest constricted. Painfully. The elegant room blurred, my vision tunneled. Blood rushed in my ears, drowning out everything except his cold stare and those 3 devastating words. Aunt Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Even she hadn't expected this cruelty. Kimberly stared at her manicure, refusing to look up. Jason wore a slight smirk, like Dad had just delivered a brilliant punchline. The silence stretched unbearable. Dozens of eyes bored into me, witnessing my utter humiliation. My legs felt like jelly, but I slowly pushed back my chair. Stood on trembling limbs. The scrape of the chair echoed, deafening in the hushed room. Shame burned through me. Like acid. This wasn't just another private disappointment. This was public rejection. A declaration that I was unworthy of even being present. My whole life, I'd tried to earn his approval. And in one brutal moment, he'd made it clear I never ever would. I gripped the edge of the table, steadying myself. Desperately fighting the urge to run, to burst into tears. No, I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. If I had to leave, I would do it with every shred of dignity I had left. Then came the sound that changed everything. The scrape of another chair. Beside me, Scott stood up. Slow, deliberate. His face, when I risked a glance through my haze of humiliation, wasn't embarrassed. It was pure, quiet fury. A confused murmur spread. My father's face darkened. He hadn't expected resistance. Not from my husband, who he probably saw as an irrelevant tag-along. Sit down, my father commanded, directly at Scott. This doesn't concern you. But Scott didn't sit. He straightened. Shoulders back. His gaze locked with my father's across the room. The tension was palpable. Electric. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then Scott did something that split my life into a before and after. He reached for his water glass and a spoon. With deliberate calm. The soft ping of metal against crystal cut through the silence, drawing every single eye. It was the universal signal for a toast. My father's face flushed with pure rage. This was his night, his moment, his carefully orchestrated display of power. And Scott had just challenged it. In the most civilized, yet unmistakable way. "What do you think you're doing?" my father demanded, but his voice had lost its authority. Scott ignored him. Waited until the room was absolutely silent, every guest frozen. His hand was steady as he set down the spoon. His expression composed, but utterly determined. I'd never seen this side of him before. This quiet, immovable strength. "I'd like to make a toast," Scott began. His voice clear. Carrying. To the woman Richard Harrington failed to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Oh my goodness," an elderly woman whispered next to me. For those who don't know me, I'm Scott Taylor, Amanda's husband. And since Richard has shared his perspective tonight, I'd like to share the truth about the daughter he just told to leave. My father stepped forward. "That's enough. Security will escort you out." "By all means," Scott replied evenly. But I wonder how the Boston Globe would report on Richard Harrington having his own daughter and son-in-law forcibly removed from his retirement party. I'm sure your banking colleagues would find that fascinating. My father froze. His gaze darted around at his professional peers. His reputation. It was everything to him. Scott had found the one lever that would work. 3 years ago, Scott continued, Amanda founded Lighthouse Press with her own savings and a small business loan. She qualified for it without any family connections. Last year, They published Salt and Stone, which was not only shortlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award, but was just optioned for a film adaptation. Murmurs of genuine interest swept through the room. This was news even to me. Scott must have gotten the call today and saved it to surprise me. What Richard failed to mention is that Amanda's press provides a platform for voices major publishers overlooked. Veterans, immigrants, and yes, people who grew up in emotionally abusive homes. Scott's gaze never wavered from my father. Their literacy program has put books in the hands of over 3,000 underprivileged children in Boston's poorest neighborhoods. I felt a surreal detachment, like I was watching a scene in a movie, not my own life. Scott was publicly defending me, cataloging achievements my father had dismissed or never even bothered to learn about. While Jason was crushing it on Wall Street and Kimberly was advancing her medical career, it was Amanda who took a leave of absence from college to care for her mother during cancer treatment. Amanda, who sat by Elaine's hospital bed, reading her favorite poems when she was too weak to hold a book herself. My throat tightened, remembering those sacred, painful, precious hours. What Richard doesn't know, Scott continued, his voice taking on a sharp edge, is that the down payment for Jason's first New York apartment came from Amanda's college fund. She gave it to him when his credit was destroyed after that gambling problem he worked so hard to hide from Daddy. Jason's face drained of color. That had been our secret. A rare, raw moment of connection between us. I'd helped him because, despite everything, he was my brother. I never expected anything in return. And certainly not this. For 32 years, Richard, you've told Amanda she wasn't enough. Too sensitive. Too artistic. Too different from the path you prescribed. You've withheld affection. You've weaponized your approval. And tonight, you attempted to humiliate her in front of everyone who matters to you. Scott looked around the room, addressing the stunned guests directly. But here's what you should know about family. Real family doesn't require performance reviews. Real family doesn't measure love by achievements. Real family sees you, supports you, and stands with you even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. My father finally found his voice. You have no right to speak this way in front of my colleagues and friends. You don't know anything about our family. I know enough, Scott replied. I know that a man who publicly rejects his daughter at his retirement dinner isn't celebrating a legacy. He's revealing its bankruptcy. The room was utterly silent. You could hear the ice shifting in water glasses. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. Scott turned to me then, his eyes softening. Amanda is the strongest person I know. Not because she met her father's impossible standards, but because she survived them and became herself. He raised his water glass one final time, turning back to my father. So, thank you, Richard Harrington, for showing us exactly the kind of parent we'll never be. With that, Scott set down his glass and gently took my hand. The warmth of his fingers around mine anchored me as the room spun with shock, embarrassment, and something else, something I couldn't yet identify. Together, we walked towards the exit. Our footsteps echoed on the marble floor. No one tried to stop us. No one spoke. The collective breath-holding of 70 stunned guests created a silence so heavy, it felt physical. As we neared the doors, my father's voice, laced with desperation, exploded again. If you walk out now, don't ever come back, he screamed. You're cut off. Do you understand? Both of you. We didn't slow. Didn't turn. Scott's hand remained steady in mine. As we passed the last table, an elderly man, one of my father's longest-serving colleagues, caught my eye. He nodded. Almost imperceptibly. A tiny gesture of respect, or maybe solidarity. It was the first time anyone from my father's world had acknowledged me as anything other than a disappointment. The doors closed behind us, muffling the explosion of conversation that immediately erupted. The valet, who must have heard everything, avoided my gaze as he hurried for our car. The night air hit my flushed face like a blessing. Cool. Clean. After the suffocating tension of that banquet hall. Scott opened the car door for me, then walked around to the driver's side. Neither of us spoke until we pulled away from the Hawthorne, its elegant facade shrinking in the rearview mirror like the setting of a particularly vivid nightmare. Are you okay? Scott finally asked, his voice gentle in the darkness of the car. I wasn't. I was shattered. Humiliated. But also, strangely, impossibly relieved. Something that had been coiled tight inside me for decades had finally snapped. Leaving me raw, yes, but somehow lighter. I don't know, I answered honestly. But I think I might be, eventually. Scott reached for my hand again, and we drove home in silence, leaving behind the wreckage of expectations and pretense. Heading towards something I couldn't yet name, but desperately wanted to discover. The emotional dam broke the second we stepped into our apartment. I collapsed onto the couch, violent sobs tearing through me. 3 decades of suppressed pain, just erupting. Scott held me. Didn't say a word. His shirt grew damp with my tears, his arms steady around my shaking shoulders. I'm sorry, I gasped between sobs. I'm so sorry you had to do that. I'm not, Scott said firmly. I've wanted to say those things to your father for 3 years. He'll never forgive us, I choked out. The thought brought fresh tears. Some childish part of me, despite everything, had never stopped hoping for reconciliation. For the father I needed, instead of the one I had. That's his loss, Scott said. And honestly, Amanda, his forgiveness isn't worth having. We stayed up until 3 a.m., just talking. Processing. The initial shock slowly gave way to a complex mix of emotions. Grief for the relationship I'd never have, searing anger at his cruelty, fear about family repercussions. And underneath it all, a tentative sense of liberation. Do you think I overstepped? Scott asked as we finally got ready for bed. The first hint of uncertainty in his voice. You stood up for me when no one ever has, I said. Including me. Sleep came in fitful bursts. The phone kept ringing. My father. 7 times between midnight and dawn. Increasingly angry voicemails, demanding apologies, threatening consequences. I let every single call go to voicemail. My phone screen, illuminating the dark. Morning brought a text from Kimberly. You've always had to make everything about you. Dad's retirement was supposed to be his night. You and Scott ruined everything as usual. I just stared at that message, realizing how completely differently she saw the entire event. In her reality, I was the villain, stealing his spotlight. Not the victim of his cruel public rejection. Then came a twist. At 10:17 a.m., Jason called. I almost didn't answer, bracing for more accusations, but something made me pick up. That was quite a show last night, he said, his tone unreadable. I didn't plan it, I replied stiffly. A pause. I know. Another pause. Is it true what Scott said about the apartment money? Yes. Why didn't you ever throw that in my face? All these years, even when I was less than supportive. Because that's not why I helped you, I said simply. The silence stretched. Finally, Jason spoke again, his voice different. Smaller, somehow. I never thanked you properly for that. And I should have. It doesn't matter now. Maybe it does. He cleared his throat. Listen, what Dad did last night, it wasn't right. I've never seen him like that. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to solidarity Jason had ever offered. After we hung up, I just stared at the phone, trying to make sense of this shift. That Monday at work, my boss, Marion, took one look at my face and pulled me into her office. You look like you've been through a war, she said, pouring me coffee. What happened? I gave her the condensed version. Her response was immediate. Take the week off. We'll manage the Hopkins manuscript. I can't just stop working because of family drama. I protested. Amanda, she said gently. If you'd broken your leg, you'd take time off to heal. Your father broke something inside you. That deserves the same consideration. I reluctantly agreed to 3 days, spending them alternating between violent crying jags and numb television binging. Scott worked from home, quietly keeping me company. The outside world went on, oblivious to my internal earthquake. On Thursday, the doorbell rang. It was Aunt Patricia. She was clutching a large manila envelope, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. May I come in? She asked. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She perched awkwardly on our couch, refusing coffee. What my brother did was unforgivable, she said, without preamble. I should have said something that night. I've been enabling Richard's behavior for years, telling myself it was just his way. She handed me the envelope. Inside were old family photographs I'd never seen. My mother, pregnant with me, looking radiant. Toddler me on my father's shoulders, both of us laughing. A family vacation, my father teaching me to fish, his expression patient, kind. He wasn't always like this, Aunt Patricia said softly. After your mother got sick the first time, something changed in Richard. He became obsessed with control, with measurable success. As if by perfectly organizing his world, he could keep tragedy at bay. I studied the photos, these glimpses of a father I didn't recognize. That doesn't excuse what he's done, I whispered. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But I thought you should know there was a time when he loved you unreservedly. That capacity exists in him, buried under years of fear and bitterness. After she left, I put the photos in my desk drawer. Couldn't look at them anymore, but couldn't throw them away either. This family implosion sent ripples everywhere. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years texted for details. My father's sister-in-law called, saying she'd always thought Richard was too hard on me. The family mythology, it was being rewritten in real time. Old power dynamics, suddenly up for re-examination. Tell me about your father, Dr. Eleanor Waters said during our first session. For the next 50 minutes, words just poured out of me. Stories I'd never fully articulated, even to Scott. She listened, without judgment, occasionally jotting notes. At the end, she looked at me thoughtfully. Amanda, have you ever heard of emotional abuse? That simple question began a 3-month journey through family dynamics, trauma responses, and the slow, agonizing process of reclaiming my self-worth. Dr. Waters helped me identify patterns I'd completely normalized, my father's conditional love, my siblings' roles in our dysfunctional system, my own adaptive behaviors that had once protected me but now utterly limited me. Healing isn't linear, she warned. You'll have setbacks. Days when the old beliefs feel more real than the new ones. That's normal. She was right. There were mornings I woke up convinced I was fundamentally flawed. Afternoons when a client's minor criticism sent me spiraling into self-doubt. Evenings when I'd check my phone, still hoping for a message from my father, despite everything. The panic attacks persisted, sometimes triggered by specific reminders, sometimes just appearing out of nowhere. Dr. Waters suggested medication. It doesn't have to be forever, she explained. Think of it as a tool, while your nervous system learns new patterns. The low-dose anti-anxiety medication made a noticeable difference within weeks. The constant background hum of dread quieted. Sleep came easier. I found myself laughing more freely with Scott, engaging more confidently at work. Meanwhile, Scott and I seriously researched Portland. The vibrant literary scene, the progressive values, the sheer physical distance from Boston, it all called to us. We made spreadsheets, comparing neighborhoods, housing costs, potential office spaces for Lighthouse Press. Are we running away? I asked Scott one night, scrolling through rental listings. We're running towards something, he corrected. There's a difference. Our decision solidified when Scott got an unexpected job offer from a Portland-based tech company developing publishing software. Significant salary increase. Option to work remotely 3 days a week. It's like the universe is confirming our plan, he said, showing me the email. We set a 6-month timeline for the move, giving us time to wrap up projects in Boston and thoughtfully transition the business. I was just explaining our Portland plans to Marion when her eyes widened, looking over my shoulder. Amanda Taylor. A woman approached my desk, her expensive perfume arriving before she did. I'm Vivian Newell. I was your father's executive assistant for 15 years. My stomach tightened. Did my father send you? I asked, wary. She shook her head. Richard has no idea I'm here. I retired last month, so he can't fire me for this conversation. She glanced around. Is there somewhere we can talk privately? Over coffee in a nearby cafe, Vivian confirmed my worst suspicions. My father's perfectionism and cutting remarks weren't just for me. They extended to his staff, especially women. He'd reduced junior associates to tears, taking credit for others' ideas, held grudges for years. The night of that retirement dinner, Vivian confided, 3 longtime colleagues told me they'd always thought Richard was unnecessarily harsh with you. Your husband's speech, It resonated with so many who'd experienced your father's darker side. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Vivian stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Because for 15 years, I watched you try to win the approval of a man who moved the goalposts every single time someone got close. I watched you blame yourself for his inability to show love. And I stayed silent. She reached across the table, briefly touching my hand. I'm not staying silent anymore. That conversation was unexpected validation. External confirmation that I hadn't imagined, hadn't exaggerated my father's treatment. It solidified my resolve to build a new life, finally unshackled from his influence. In the following weeks, I started reaching out to cousins on my mother's side, people I'd lost touch with after her death. To my surprise, many welcomed the reconnection. My mother's sister, Judith, invited Scott and me to her Connecticut home. She shared family stories and photographs I'd never seen. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become, Aunt Judith told me, showing me my mom's college journals. She was an artist, too, before she met your father and adopted his priorities. This glimpse into my mother's unfulfilled creative ambitions created a whole new connection with her. I'd always thought my artistic tendencies came from nowhere, an anomaly in a family of practical professionals. Learning they were an inheritance from my mother felt like reclaiming a precious piece of my own identity. Months after the dinner, I was giving a speech at a small literary event, talking about Lighthouse Press's mission to amplify overlooked voices. Halfway through, I realized I was speaking with total confidence. No constant internal editing. No self-doubt. You were magnificent, Scott said afterward. I didn't picture my father's disapproving face once, I marveled. Not even when I stumbled over that author's name. It was a breakthrough. Dr. Waters acknowledged it. You're internalizing a new voice, she observed. Your own voice of self-acceptance is becoming louder than his voice of criticism. Our Portland plans moved forward. We found a charming craftsman house with a converted garage perfect for a small office. Deposit down. Our commitment to a fresh start, now concrete. Back in Boston, I expanded Lighthouse Press's mission, creating a special imprint for memoirs focused on family reconciliation and healing from emotional abuse. It felt professionally exciting and deeply, personally meaningful. A way to transform my pain into purpose. My relationship with Jason continued its tentative thaw. He called occasionally, our conversations slowly deepening. During one call, he confessed he'd started therapy himself. That night at Dad's retirement, he admitted, it forced me to look at some things I'd been avoiding. Like how I've spent my entire adult life chasing Dad's approval and how utterly exhausting that is. Kimberly, though, remained firmly in my father's camp. She sent a formal wedding invitation addressed only to Scott, with a little post-it, no drama, please. We politely declined, sent a generous gift from their registry. 6 months after the dinner, Scott and I started discussing starting a family. A conversation I'd always avoided, terrified I'd inherited my father's capacity for emotional damage. What if I'm like him? I whispered, naming my deepest fear. What if I don't know how to love a child unconditionally? The fact that you're asking that question, Scott said, means you won't be like him. You're aware of the patterns. You're doing the work to heal them. That night, I had a breakthrough therapy session. I finally expressed my rage toward my father without tempering it with understanding or excuses. Dr. Waters encouraged me to write him a letter I'd never send, pouring out decades of hurt and anger. I hate what you did to me, I wrote, my pen pressing so hard it tore the paper. Asterisk, I hate that you made me believe I was fundamentally flawed. I hate that even now, part of me still craves your approval. Asterisk, the release was cathartic. Afterward, I realized it had been weeks since I'd thought about my father daily. His power over my emotional state was diminishing, his absence becoming less of a wound and more of a fact. During our last week in Boston, I received an unexpected email. From the elderly colleague, the one who'd nodded to me that night. I'm retiring to Portland myself next month, he wrote. Richard and I had a falling out recently over his treatment of a young analyst that reminded me of his behavior toward you. If you and Scott are settled by then, perhaps we could meet for coffee. Sometimes, chosen family is more important than biological connections. As we packed our belongings into a moving truck, I found Aunt Patricia's envelope of old photographs. Looking at them now, they caused less pain. It was as if they depicted characters in a story, not my actual family. I packed them alongside newer photos, Scott and me hiking, our literary festival booth buzzing with readers, a dinner party with friends who loved us exactly as we were. On our last night in the empty Boston apartment, Scott found me at the window, looking out at the city lights. Having second thoughts? He asked, wrapping his arms around me. No, I said truthfully. Just saying goodbye to the person I was here. The one who never felt good enough. She was always good enough, Scott said. She just couldn't see it yet. As we drove west the next morning, I realized something quietly profound. I hadn't checked my phone for messages from my father in over a week. It wasn't conscious. Just a natural fading of an old habit that no longer served me. The constant ache of his rejection had transformed into something different. Not an absence of pain, but a deep presence of self-respect. Portland welcomed us with a week of unseasonable sunshine, as if the universe was affirming our decision. As we unpacked boxes in our new home, I found the cracked wedding picture frame. From the night of my father's final visit. I'd kept the frame, but I'd replaced the glass. I think this belongs here, I said, placing it on the mantel. A reminder of what we brought with us and what we left behind. Scott smiled, understanding perfectly. The past made us who we are, he said, but it doesn't get to decide who we become. 1 year after that devastating retirement dinner, I stood in our Portland kitchen, cradling a glass of sparkling cider. Through the window, Scott was grilling on our back deck, surrounded by our new friends, our chosen family. Spring sunshine filtered through cherry blossoms, dappling our yard with light. The past year had brought changes I couldn't have imagined that painful night in Boston. Lighthouse Press had flourished, winning an innovation award. My therapy sessions were now monthly check-ins. And most significantly, I was 4 months pregnant with our first child. Need any help? Aunt Patricia asked, having flown out for our housewarming. Her relationship with my father had grown strained after she continued contact with me, but at 68, she'd finally prioritized her own values over family harmony. I'm good, thanks, I smiled, handing her appetizers. The doorbell rang. It was Jason. Travel rumpled, but smiling tentatively. Sorry I'm late, flight was delayed. I hugged him, still getting used to this new, warmer relationship. We'd progressed from awkward phone calls to genuine conversations. He'd visited twice, each time opening up more about his own struggles with Dad's expectations. Come in, I said. Everyone's out back. How's Claire? I asked, referring to his new girlfriend, a kindergarten teacher who seemed to bring out a gentler side of him. She's good. Couldn't get the time off. He hesitated, then handed me an envelope. I've been debating whether to show you this, but I think you should know. Inside was a short article from a Boston business publication. A small photo of my father. The headline, former First Atlantic EVP Richard Harrington hospitalized after minor stroke. He's physically okay, Jason added quickly, seeing my expression. But it's been a wake-up call. He's alone a lot now. Kimberly visits when she can, but, you know. I studied the photo. He looked older. Diminished. I'm sorry to hear he's unwell, I said honestly. But I don't know what you expect me to do with this information. Jason shrugged. Nothing, necessarily. Just thought you should know. I placed the article on the counter, promising myself I'd process it later. Today was about celebration. Not old wounds. The party flowed around me, a joyful gathering of people who supported us. My colleagues chatted with Scott's tech friends, Patricia exchanged gardening tips with our neighbor. Jason gradually relaxed, even showing uncharacteristic interest in one of our authors' discussions about narrative therapy. As evening approached, Scott called for everyone's attention, raising his glass. 1 year ago, Amanda and I made the best decision of our lives moving to Portland. But the journey started earlier, with a moment of truth at a certain retirement dinner. Knowing glances passed among those familiar with our story. That night could have broken us. But instead, it freed us. He turned to me, his eyes soft. To Amanda, who taught me that real strength isn't about never falling, but about rising every time life knocks you down. And to all of you who've become our Portland family, thank you for welcoming us exactly as we are. Glasses clinked. Everyone toasted. Standing there, surrounded by genuine affection, I felt a completeness I'd spent decades searching for. The validation I desperately sought from my father had always been a mirage, disappearing as I approached. Real acceptance, I'd learned, didn't require contorting myself to meet someone else's expectations. After our guests departed, Jason, uncharacteristically domestic, helped us clean up, loading the dishwasher. "I have a confession," he said, folding a dish towel with unexpected precision. "I've been seeing a therapist for 8 months now." "That's great, Jason," I said, genuinely pleased. "It's changing how I see everything. Dad. Myself. You." He leaned against the counter. "Did you know I was jealous of you growing up?" I nearly dropped the plate I was rinsing. "Jealous of me?" "You were the golden child." "I was the obedient child," he corrected. "I did everything Dad wanted, and I got his approval, sure. But you always knew who you were. Even when it cost you everything, you stayed true to yourself." I never had that kind of courage. We talked late into the night, sharing perspectives on our childhood that made me see familiar events through new eyes. When Jason finally left for his hotel, he hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry I wasn't a better brother," he whispered. "We're writing a new story now," I reminded him. "That's what matters." 3 days later, while visiting Powell's books, I received a text from Kimberly. The first direct communication in months. "Dad asking for you." "Probably nothing. Just thought you should know." I stood frozen among the bookshelves, my hand instinctively moving to my slightly rounded belly. The old Amanda would have dropped everything. Rushed back to Boston, desperate for this potential opening. The new Amanda recognized the message for what it was, Kimberly's way of transferring responsibility, of making any continued estrangement my choice, rather than our father's. After careful consideration and a long talk with Scott, I composed a simple response. "Thank you for letting me know. I hope he recovers well." Not a door slammed shut, but not a desperate rush through an open one either. Just acknowledgement of a shared humanity that existed independent of our broken relationship. 2 weeks later, I had a chance encounter that crystallized how far I'd come. While visiting a friend in the hospital, I rounded a corner and nearly collided with my father. He looked startled, then wary. He'd lost weight, and a slight droop affected one side of his face, evidence of the stroke Jason had mentioned. "Amanda," he said, his voice rougher. "Dad," I replied, surprised by my steady calm. "Jason mentioned you were having some health issues. I hope you're doing better." He nodded stiffly. "Just a checkup. Nothing serious." We stood awkwardly in the hospital corridor, medical staff flowing around us like a stream around 2 stubborn rocks. "You look different," he finally said. I smiled slightly. "I'm pregnant. Due in November." Something flickered across his face. Surprise. Perhaps a hint of some deeper emotion, quickly suppressed. "I see. Congratulations." "Thank you." Another silence stretched, filled with decades of things unsaid. I realized I was waiting for something. An apology, perhaps. Or some acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. But his expression remained carefully neutral, his posture rigid. "I should go," I said finally. "My friend is waiting." He nodded. "Give my regards to Scott." It was such a conventional pleasantry, so at odds with our last interaction, that I almost laughed. Instead, I simply nodded and moved past him. What struck me afterward wasn't what had happened, but what hadn't. No accelerated heartbeat. No tunnel vision. No desperate need to make him love me. I'd spoken to my father as one adult to another, without the weight of my childhood wounds dictating my responses. The encounter left me contemplative, but not devastated. "He'll never change," I told Scott that night. "Not fundamentally." "Probably not," Scott agreed. "Are you okay with that?" I considered the question carefully. "I think I am. For the first time, I truly understand that his limitations aren't my failure." That autumn, as the Portland trees turned brilliant shades of orange and red, we prepared our home for the baby. Jason visited twice, bringing impractically extravagant gifts. Aunt Patricia sent handmade quilts and updates, including gossip that my father was seeing a woman from his church, a widow who apparently tolerated his difficult personality. Good for him, I said when I heard, genuinely meaning it. His happiness or unhappiness no longer defined my own. In late November, our daughter, Lily Eleanor Taylor, was born after 20 hours of labor. Holding her for the first time, I was overwhelmed by a love so fierce, so unconditional, it brought tears to my eyes. "She's perfect," Scott whispered, gently touching her tiny fingers. Looking at our daughter's peaceful face, I made a silent promise. She would grow up knowing she was enough, exactly as she was. Her worth would never be tied to achievements or conformity to someone else's vision. She would be loved for her authentic self, whatever shape that took. Jason flew in to meet his niece the following week, awkwardly cradling her with a mixture of terror and wonder. "She has Mom's eyes," he observed, touching her cheek gently. I thought so too, glad someone else noticed the connection to our mother. He hesitated, then added, "I told Dad about her." He didn't say much, but he asked to see a picture. I nodded, neither encouraged nor distressed by the information. My father was now a peripheral figure in my story, no longer its defining force. As Christmas approached, we held a small dinner for our chosen family, friends who'd become essential to our Portland life, Jason and his now serious girlfriend, Claire, and Aunt Patricia. Our home glowed with warmth and laughter. Lily passed from loving arms to loving arms as we shared food and stories. After dinner, as we gathered in the living room, Scott proposed a toast. "To family," he said simply. "Not just the one we're born into, but the one we create through love and choice." To family, everyone echoed, glasses raised. Looking around at these people who accepted me completely, who saw my strengths and weaknesses and loved me anyway, I finally understood the lesson of that painful retirement dinner a year and a half ago. What had seemed like an ending, the final rejection by my father, had actually been a beginning. By standing up and walking out with Scott that night, I'd taken the first step toward finding my true home. Lily began to fuss, and I excused myself to nurse her in the quiet of her nursery. Rocking gently in the chair Scott had restored for us, I studied my daughter's perfect face and felt a peace I'd never known before. "You will never have to earn my love," I whispered to her. "It's already yours. Completely. And forever." In that moment, I realized I had given myself the same gift, unconditional acceptance of who I was, separate from achievement or external validation. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still difficult days, but I had found my way to a truth that had eluded me for 32 years. I was enough. I had always been enough. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room, and Lily's tiny hand gripped my finger with surprising strength. This was my legacy now. Not my father's disappointment, but my daughter's future. Not a path dictated by someone else's values, but one I was creating with each authentic choice. So, what about you? Have you ever had to find freedom from toxic family expectations? Or maybe someone stood up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself? I genuinely love to hear your experiences and thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear that they, too, are enough, exactly as they are. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away from what hurts us and towards what helps us heal.